Very good afternoon once again. It is 2:30 here at the BBC Election Centre, and we are reflecting on a remarkable night and morning of results. There's one still to come, and we are, of course, talking about the implications of this election result. So a majority Conservative government, a dreadful night for Labour, an even worse night for the Lib Dems, a stunning night for the SNP. So that's the picture. And at this point, the seats declared with just one to come in St Ives. We have the Conservatives on 330 and Labour on 232, which does mean a Conservative majority of 12. 12 in terms of the House of Commons, and that is not very big, but it's manageable. Let's have a look at the seats. We'll break down the seats for you so that if you're just joining us here, we can bring you right up to date. We've seen 330 and 232 on the big board on the Palace of Westminster. The SNP, just to underline their achievement, on 56, that's a gain of 50. It is an absolutely astounding performance by the SNP. The DUP in Northern Ireland on 8, that's no change. The Lib Dems having suffered a truly terrible night, having lost 48 seats. They're on 8, and Nick Clegg, the party leader, has resigned. Labour's Ed Miliband, too, has resigned. UKIP on just 1, after all the projections, and despite the fact that, as Nigel Farage was saying, they'd managed to attract some millions of votes. They end up on 1 seat. The Greens won. They've kept Brighton Pavilion. That's Caroline Lucas. So that's where we are. That's how the seats break down at the moment. Let's have a quick look at the share, because that tells us its own story too, especially where UKIP are concerned, having taken 13% of the vote across the UK, and they end up with 1 seat. The SNP take 5% of the vote. You look at that across the UK, they take 50% in Scotland, 5% across the UK. They get, what was it, 56 seats. So Nigel Farage already making points there about the first-past-the-post system and the way that it distributes seats. Labour, having gained a couple of percentage points, but failing to take seats from the Conservatives in those marginals. So that's why they've really suffered. The Lib Dems, well, to be honest, they've been damaged by the Conservatives. Conservatives are taking so many seats from the Lib Dems, that's why they're in that position. The Greens on 4%, which is a pretty significant increase for them of 3% on 2010, and yet they are still on 1 seat only in Brighton Pavilion. The other seat they had hopes in, Bristol West, well, that went. And then, of course, Holborn and St Pancras, where the party leader was standing, Natalie Bennett, that again was lost to them. So they end up on just 1 seat. So if I were to turn to Andy Marr at this point, I'd say to you, Andrew, what is the story this afternoon for you?
This may be a distasteful analogy, but it's a bit like thinking of the coalition. It's a bit like an unhappy marriage where after it ends, one party hacks to death the other one, because there was this, extraordinary coalition. They were very closely together all the way through. The minute it comes apart, the Tories just go for the Liberal Democrats in the most ferocious and successful way. The other thing I ask myself as a commentator is how the heck, in the future, are we going to get accurate information about what's going on? In the past, we've looked at the polls and we've talked to the parties. I talked to all the parties. I was assured by the Liberal Democrats they were holding on to those seats in the South West. It was going very, very well for them indeed. They had the detailed information on the ground. I was assured by the Labour Party their ground war was devastating up in the North West and the Midlands. Clearly wasn't. And I turned to the opinion polls and they have proved to be virtually completely useless. We're going to have to make our own minds up in future, Hugh. Where will it end?
A dreadful thought.
Terrible thought.
You mentioned the Lib Dems being savaged there by the Conservatives. Well, one of those Lib Dem victims is Simon Hughes, who's been the MP for Southern Bermondsey since the early 80s. And I think he's with Andrew Neil.
Yes, Hugh, he is indeed. Simon Hughes is with me. So is Fiona McTaggart, a Labour MP who won her seat of Slough, one of the not many Labour MPs in the south of England, outside of London. Let me come to Simon Hughes first. When you and I were on the election results programme last night, you seemed a bit down, even though the result was still a way away. Did you have a foreboding that things were not going well for you?
In the last 24 hours, election day, particularly, I sensed that the people weren't coming out in the numbers that we needed to hold our seat, and that Labour was doing better. They made a huge effort in my seat. Hundreds of people came. Fiona, I think, would confirm, as others would. So we were one of the targets, and I sensed that people were voting Labour because they wanted to get rid of a Tory government. And of course the paradox is, it wasn't, I don't think, a personal vote against me or against us locally. They got rid of the MP and they've ended up with the Tory government.
You had a very strong personal profile. You were what the many Lib Dems thought it was the incumbent, and the incumbency, because you were well known, had worked hard in the constituency, would have been a huge help to you. But when it came to it, the general swing against the Lib Dems, the desire to do down the Lib Dems, seemed to overwhelm that.
It did. I mean, incumbency will have added to our votes. I'm very sad that all my colleagues who... Liberal Democrats and Liberals have always had to fight harder to win seats, Andrew, as you know, and fight harder to hold seats.
But you were good at holding them, weren't you?
And we were good at holding that. But the phrase that came to mind last night, and my constituency has strong Shakespeare connections, the whole speech doesn't work, but the phrase works. There is a tide in the affairs of men. And in politics, liberalism was very strong. The first part of the last century, there were Liberal MPs in my area, and then from 1939 to when I won the seat, there were no Liberal representatives. And I've had the huge privilege of being Member of Parliament for Bermondsey and the old borough of Southwark for 32 years, and we've taken a battering. But the other thought I had that come from a part of the world where there's lots of strong boxing tradition, we had a bruising last night. But that doesn't mean to say that that's the end of a career. Liberalism is as needed as ever, but we weren't able to win the argument. And somebody stopped me this morning and said, people will only in the next few years realise the advantage of having had Liberal Democrats in government, in the coalition, tempering the Tories. And now a Tory-owned government, I congratulate David Cameron and the Tories, but the Tory government is not, in my view, what Britain needs. We need a fairer society, and the Tories never deliver that.
Liberalism in the form of the Liberal Democrats may come back, though it may take some time as well, because you have gone down to, I think it's 8 MPs. But is this the end of Simon Hughes's parliamentary career?
It's a bit early to answer that question, Andrew, after 2 hours sleep. I've always made clear that...
You got 2 hours sleep, you're lucky.
Yeah, I know. I've always made clear that I don't believe in an unelected House of Lords. I have no interest in suddenly being... If anybody offered it, nobody has, but if anybody offered me place of Lords, I don't ever intend to do that. If we had an elected second chamber, that would be a different question. But Labour and us would have wanted that, I hope, but I don't see the Tories about to do that. No,
you won't stand again for the Commons?
No, I haven't made that decision. I know that we have a hugely strong, we have lots of members in my constituency, we have a very strong council group with the opposition to Labour on the council. We want to go on fighting for the things we fought in the election campaign, for the affordable housing that Londoners need, we've talked about often, for a sort of a national health service that looks after people properly. So the fight goes on. The fight in Simon Hughes has not ended.
All right.
Yes, I lost the bout yesterday, but I've had the privilege of winning the previous 8 bouts.
And all right, let
there's
me
more life in the old dog.
bring in Fiona McTaggart. You won your seat. There was about a 1.8% swing to you in Slough, just to the west of London. But the Conservatives got 2 million votes more than Labour nationwide. On share of the vote in England, they got about 40% of the vote. You got just over 30%. You were wiped out in Scotland. That's got all the publicity. But I would suggest to you, you have an English problem too.
I think we've got a problem in terms of the way we've addressed voters. I think we ran a campaign which targeted what the leadership of the Labour Party saw as its base and actually didn't reach out to a wider coalition of voters. And frankly, unless you reach out to voters, unless you engage with them, unless you talk to them, they do what the voters did to Labour in the election yesterday, which is say, a plague on your houses. And I think that there's a very clear message to us, which is that Labour Party, if it wants to win, has to be the party of ambition as well as of hard work. It has to be the party of actually engaging with people on principles that we believe in. I mean, one of the reasons I think why the Liberal Democrats did so badly was a feeling that they had made in the last election tuition fees as their core issue. And actually, even if people liked some of the things that the Liberal Democrats did during this government, they felt somehow that they don't believe what they're putting forward because they didn't make that core of the government.
Can I bring you back to Labour, though?
I think the same thing is true of Labour. I think people want politicians who say, all we have before we get elected is our word, is what we offer. And we need to offer not calculated, managed things. We actually need to offer a vision of a society in which everyone feels that they have a part to play. And I I'm afraid we failed to do that.
You may not be prepared to tell me who you will support in the coming leadership election for your party, but can you tell me, though if you will, that would be great, but can you tell me what you'll be looking for?
Well, actually, what I would first of all want is not rushing into a leadership election. What we don't need is a beauty contest at the moment. What we need is an analysis of why Labour did so very badly. We did not engage with the voters. People felt that we weren't speaking their language, that we just didn't get their lives. And unless we work out what the Labour Party has to offer, it frankly doesn't matter who leads it. What we need to do is to reach out with an offer which makes sense to the voter. And so I feel reluctant to get engaged in an election campaign right now. I think we've got a big job of work to do. One of the problems that we played 5 years ago is that we spent a long time after the general election talking to ourselves about who we wanted as our leader. I think that's a profound mistake.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. Fiona McTaggart, Simon Hughes, thank you. Both back to Hugh in the election studio.
Andrew, thank you very much. Well, can I just say there was some pretty vigorous nodding of heads here. Andy, what were you...
I don't mean to be disrespectful in any way, Hugh, but Fiona McTaggart is one shrewd cookie, and she's absolutely right. The Labour Party has to decide what it is, much more important than who happens to lead it. And I may not have been paying attention properly, but I didn't hear Ed Miliband in this election talk a lot about wealth creation or small business or productivity, all those people working in the private sector. He talked a lot about public sector workers on low pay, but it was all a bit workerist, a bit state, a bit our tribe, not their tribe. And that sense of reaching out, the Labour Party has to find a way to attract and get the attention of people who are making profits, employing other people, working in small businesses who are not part of the state system. And I think that was a big failure this time round. I think Fiona McTaggart is exactly right. Next time, they have to find new ways to reach out to those people.
Interesting.
Jackie?
No, I completely agree with you about that. I agree with your analysis of the campaign. I think it's important that this is a party which, as Fiona rightly says, builds the widest possible coalition, public, private sector, people who are concerned about the future, as well as people who've got fears of about the current time. Where I've got some concerns, however, is that Fiona's right about what happened after 2010. We spent too long talking to ourselves rather than engaging with the people that we needed to build that coalition of. I just worry about whether or not we can do that if we're leaders. You know, Harriet Harman will do a brilliant job, but can we actually have that debate without a leader who can lead it?
Well, Ed Miliband hasn't given you the option of having a pause before a leadership election campaign. He's thrown you into it.
Let's pause for a second, because one of the big things Labour has to think about is where it goes in Scotland. I mean, Andy was saying earlier that that recovery could take, well, not just a long time, a lifetime, really, given what's happened overnight. Let's join Sarah Smith. Hi, Sarah, and I know you have some guests there.
I certainly do, Hugh, because people in Scotland are still trying to digest across the political spectrum what's happened here. Far, far greater success for the SNP than they ever dared hope for, and a much, much worse result for Scottish Labour than they ever feared. I've got with me now Catherine MacLeod, who's a former Labour advisor, and also Leslie Riddoch, a journalist and a well-known Yes supporter. Catherine MacLeod, let me ask you first. 50% of Scotland voted for the SNP. That means lots of people who voted no to independence in September voted for the SNP. How did you lose those voters?
Well, I think quite a lot of people looked at Nicola Sturgeon, thought she had a great campaign. She was, I think, very much the star of the campaign, and thought that they could vote for Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP and help perhaps even deliver a Labour government. I think the choice was between Nicola Sturgeon and Ed Miliband, and I think quite a lot of people in Scotland opted for Nicola Sturgeon.
Now, Leslie Riddoch, throughout the campaign, Nicola Sturgeon made very clear that this was not about independence, and that even if they had a stunning result like they did last night, it wouldn't mean there would be another referendum. But with this success, it's got to increase the pressure on her putting it in the manifesto for the Holyrood elections in 2016 and going for a referendum sooner rather than later.
Well, I know it might come as a shock to everybody because people have got so used to political leaders outside Scotland, it would have to be said, saying one thing and doing another. But actually, I think as far as the SNP are concerned, and Nicola Sturgeon in particular, she does what she says on the tin. And what she said all the way through was that this wasn't about independence, it was an anti-austerity programme. That's probably why there was 900,000 Labour or no voters that joined the cause during the campaign. And I think she's also very wary because, after all, 50% of Scots did not vote for the SNP. Now, there's no point in going through the whole rigmarole of another independence referendum unless you see a really big shift. And that shift may happen in times to come. The European referendum, in-out referendum, has been seen as one flashpoint, but who knows when there might be others. And it's irresponsible, I think, really, to think that we go through this again, the second referendum, in a very short period of time, unless there's a reasonable expectation of success.
Catherine MacLeod, we know Ed Miliband has resigned as leader of the Labour Party across the UK. It looks as though Jim Murphy, the Scottish Labour leader, is going to hold on, even though he actually lost his seat. Can he or can anyone else start to rebuild the Labour brand in Scotland before the 2016 elections for Holyrood, before the 2020 elections for Westminster?
I think Jim Murphy will be as good a bet as anybody, but I do think it very much depends on who succeeds Ed Miliband. I think it's the leader of the Labour Party that is most important, without trying to diminish Jim Murphy's role, but I think that is the key election, who is going to succeed Ed Miliband, and Jim Murphy will prosper or not prosper in his wake.
And Leslie, it looks as though England and Scotland are now going in very different directions. If we say that Scotland voted further to the left when they voted for this huge block of SNP MPs, and we saw England voting Conservatives in numbers we didn't expect them to, will this journey continue with the two countries moving further and further apart in their political culture, do you think?
Well, I think it will. Because even today, if you hear what we're hearing from David Cameron, he's promising constitutional change, to deliver on the Smith Commission ideas as fast as possible. Well, Smith is dead in the water. Every time there's been an attempt, it started with the Calman Commission. By the time it was implemented, it was out of date. Smith is now out of date. And what needs to happen is a much, much bolder move forward. Because if we're looking for some of the ideas in Smith, for example, it's been described as a transparent fiscal trap by many commentators here, because it doesn't give you control over national insurance, it doesn't give you tax-creating powers, it doesn't give you the minimum wage. So what's on the table is not really good enough. And David Cameron's going to have to think again on that.
And as David Cameron was saying that they would deliver a strong devolved powers for Scotland, more powers than any other devolved parliament has in the world, he also talked about fairness for English voters. He's talking about English votes for English laws, making sure that Scottish MPs can't vote on certain bits of legislation. That's going to change the political consequences for Scotland forever if he delivers that.
Well, it would change them if it happens, but people have been talking about this for the best part of 30 years and it hasn't happened. But I think what you said earlier is interesting. I'm not sure, and it's never been explained to me in this whole campaign, what is the divergence of political culture between England and Scotland. I do not see this left-wing bastion of politics in Scotland. If we look at the statistics in education and health, for example, which are very dear to all our hearts, there is investment in England, there are more poor kids going to university in England than there are in Scotland. So I think it's easy to see. I don't think it's very easy to explain what this political divergence is.
All right, well, Catherine MacLeod, Leslie Ruder, thank you very much. We'll have to leave it there. Back to you, Hugh.
Sarah, thanks very much, and thanks to your guests too. Let's go back to Downing Street, because David Cameron left just a short while ago, and that's the purpose of this visit actually is to just step out onto Whitehall, where the 70th anniversary commemoration of Victory in Europe Day will be taking place in about 10 minutes' time, but they're gathering already in Whitehall. Let's have a look to see what's going on. There are hundreds of veterans, many of whom we met last year at the 70th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy. And they've been given every help to come today in Whitehall. The Band of the Welsh Guards and the Senior Director of Music of the Welsh Guards, Wayne Hopler, in charge, and they'll be taking a very prominent part in today's commemoration. But among those people invited, not just the veterans and their families, because of course that's very important, and they're battling the elements this afternoon, some specks of rain already. With the veterans, we will have some of our political leaders, some of whom have, of course, been involved in the election overnight, and they include the Prime Minister, David Cameron, and they include the Lib Dem leader, Nick Clegg, soon to be stepping down, and Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, for whom this will be his last official engagement as leader of the Labour Party. There'll be Peter Robinson, the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales, and Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. We saw a plane touching down at City Airport a couple of hours ago. So at the Cenotaph, the Band of the Welsh Guards are playing already, but the event itself and a 2-minute silence will start at 3 o'clock, and we'll be there to have a look at that when it happens. In the meantime, we were talking about opinion polls, and Andy was saying in his usual pithy way that the polls in the campaign had been pretty hopeless, I think you said, Andy, yes?
Completely useless.
Completely useless.
All the way through.
Unlike the triumphant exit
Yes,
poll.
I was
that
going
we
to say
had
that
last
did do
night.
well at the
That
end.
was right.
But, so why don't we have a word with the king of polling, yes? The man who's in charge, the figurehead, if you like, for all that is good in polling. John, nice to see you again.
Nice, hi.
So, try not to be too smug about your triumph last night with the exit poll, because that clearly was a triumph. But maybe explain to us what you think was happening during the campaign, which meant that the polls we saw during the campaign didn't prepare us for the result.
Well, let me go answer your question backwards, because can I slightly dispute Andrew's suggestion that the polls were useless? Actually, so
I was
far,
being vivid.
Actually, so far as the performance of the SNP is concerned, the polls were pretty much spot on. So far as UKIP were concerned, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, estimated shares of the vote pretty much spot on. The problem, and I acknowledge it's a pretty serious problem, is that they underestimated Conservative support, overestimated Labour support. Now, there are inevitably two possible explanations to this. One is that there was indeed some strong late movement, even later than those polls that were polling as late as on Wednesday evening. Or alternatively, that indeed there are still problems with the way in which the polls are conducted. And there is a track record here. The truth is that at most, though not all recent elections, the polls have tended to underestimate the Conservatives, overestimate Labour. And that's indeed why many of my academic colleagues, such as election forecasting, who were doing those forecasts for Newsnight, who didn't quite get as close as we did, but again, they were frankly admitting that we think the polls will not be entirely right, and we're making allowance for that. They just didn't make a big enough allowance. So the polls could be wrong, and it could be the late swing. Now, inevitably, that's a pretty important question to answer. So one of my other hats, I'm afraid, is that I'm president of the British Polling Council, which is the organisation that tries to ensure that the methodology that the opinion pollsters do is transparent. It's the organisation that ensures that the moment a poll is conducted, you can find the tables on the internet. And we've immediately agreed, together with the Market Research Society, to set up an inquiry into what's happened this time, not dissimilar to the one in 1992, the last time the polls that got it wrong. And Professor Patrick Sturgis, a survey methodologist and statistician from Southampton University, who's entirely independent of any of the polling companies, is going to chair that inquiry. So, yes, the market research industry has taken, as it were, the criticism on the chin, as indeed is going to try and find out what went wrong. It will publish a report, and it will be there for everybody to see, to judge for themselves what did go wrong.
OK, John, thanks very much again. John Curtis there. Thoughts, Andy?
I would never, ever dare to argue with the god of the algorithms. But my frustration, which is real, was that for so long in the campaign we had these neck-and-neck polls, and it made the rest of us, frankly, distort our coverage. We were making Ed Miliband and the campaign look too good. We were being a little bit too down on what the Tories were doing. The whole campaign was seen through this prism, which turned out to be the wrong prism.
No, you're absolutely
I think it's a real problem for the future. I would much prefer to do the next general election campaign without polls at all, frankly.
Yes, because the Tory campaign was criticised for not being effective enough, and hence we had that change in tactic from David Cameron. He suddenly became fired up, he suddenly became pumped up because they felt they weren't getting anywhere, and in fact, they clearly were. Or it was a case of a lot more shy Tories than people actually gave credit to, people coming back perhaps from UKIP as well.
Briefly.
I think there were a lot of people that didn't make up their mind until quite late on, and I think there were also quite a lot of people, presumably, who perhaps were shy Tories or even quiet kippers and who didn't properly necessarily represent their views.
Nice to have you with us, Jackie, and thank you for coming in. Good to see you. And just a reminder that the 2-minute silence for the commemoration of VE Day will start in about 5 minutes' time. So let's pop over to Westminster and join Andrew once again.
Thanks, Hugh. We've assembled the cream of Her Majesty's Law Press Corps here with Isabel Oakeshott and Steve Richards. Steve, let me come to you first. The Conservative and Labour Scottish problem is apparent enough, but let me concentrate. Let me look at the coming Labour leadership election in the context of Labour's English problem. 2 million votes behind the Tories, 41% of the vote to the Tories, just over 30 to Labour. Boundary changes coming up, which will give the Tories another 20 seats. They have an English problem.
They do, and it's a massive mountain. I mean, it's very interesting after an election defeat how things just keep moving. So the embryonic leadership campaigns are taking shape today as we're speaking. And I don't think any of them yet have contemplated the scale of the challenge, because you're right, there's an England challenge, but there's this massive Scottish challenge, which raises one overwhelming question. Can a leader make the same pitch to get England back that gets Scotland back?
Yes.
And if so, what the hell is it?
Because the headline criticism of Labour would be too right-wing for Scotland, too left-wing for England.
Yeah.
I don't know how you resolve that.
Well, it needs a titan. It needs a really big figure to resolve that question. And that, by resolving it, if anyone can, you address all kinds of other things, like what does left-of-centre party stand for in England? Can it be a UK-wide appeal? And so on. I mean, these are very, very big questions. And it is interesting how they rush into getting ready to declare their candidacies. They're going to have to do some pretty deep thinking and fast, assuming this contest happens quite quickly, which I think it will.
Isabel, biographer of David Cameron, coming out in the autumn, I think.
That's
is that
right?
right?
Yeah.
So the books will still sell now that he's still Prime Minister. So congratulations on that. You know better than most that he was never that popular among his own backbenchers, but he's won an election with an overall majority. Will this help him keep the show on the road when he's got to go to Europe and negotiate some powers back to London?
Well, I think that's a really critical question, and it's interesting that one of the first people that David Cameron has asked in to see him in Downing Street this afternoon has been Graham Brady, the chairman of the so-called 1922 committee, which is the representative body of backbenchers.
He's like the shop steward of Tory backbenchers.
That's right, and I think that tells us just how anxious David Cameron is. Of course, there is the euphoria. He has won a majority, but now he's actually got to work with it, and it is a very small majority, and he has had a big problem, a long-running problem with his relationship with his backbenchers. And whilst, of course, they're going to give him a little bit of credit for having delivered what he delivered last night, it doesn't suddenly change the way a lot of them feel about the way he has treated them.
I mean, he's got to be a little bit more popular, I would suggest, with Tory backbenchers today. He has won, and they've not won since 1992.
Yeah, no, today he is popular with his backbenchers. It is today an achievement. But it's only, I think, it's very interesting, because everyone is surprised by the result. We're not reflecting quite what this place is going to be like in the years to come. Exactly. It's kind of, it's a tiny majority, like Harold Wilson won in October '74. Now then, everyone thought Wilson was going to do much better than that. So he was despondent by this majority that Cameron and co, rightly today, are euphoric about. But it's only because of those low expectations. There's trouble to come on many fronts, don't you think, Isabel, with that majority of 5?
I think there's big trouble. I mean, of course, he does have an advantage now, which is that he's got a lot more jobs to distribute, all those ministerial posts.
We have a very important event coming up with a 2-minute silence, so I must interrupt you and hand back to Hugh.
The scene at the Cenotaph in Whitehall. And on the left there we can see Carwyn Jones, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland. Peter Robinson is there too. You can see Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, Nick Clegg, Michael Fallon, Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, Ed Miliband. And we have representatives to our different government departments, including cabinet ministers and former ministers in the last coalition government. Nicola Sturgeon, who arrived just a short while ago, and the Duke of York, representing the royal family, who will lay a wreath on behalf of all members of the royal family. Heads of the armed forces also here, the Chief of the Defence Staff, the Chief of the General Staff, Chief of the Air Staff, the First Sea Lord, Chief of Naval Staff. All assembled in Whitehall to mark the 70th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, when the Second World War came to an end in Europe. 2-minute silence will begin. buglers of the Royal Marines bringing to an end the 2-minute silence at the Cenotaph in Whitehall, and the firing of ceremonial rounds 2 in London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast by Royal Navy ships at sea as well. The Duke of York lays a wreath on behalf of the royal family, and he'll be followed by political leaders who've gathered in Whitehall today, the day after the general election. David Cameron, Nick Clegg and Ed Miliband lay their own wreaths, their own tributes. There is full coverage of the service and commemoration in Whitehall for you on BBC One right now. So if you want to follow the events in Whitehall, just turn over and can watch the coverage there on BBC One. Here on BBC Two, we're just really trying to take stock after what's been a remarkable 24 hours, the general election, the results that we've been discussing and the implications of those results, not least for the leaders that we've just seen there in Whitehall, and not just the leaders of the three traditionally big Westminster parties, but of course for leaders in other parts of the UK too, including Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland and Scottish Labour, who've had such a difficult time. Andrew Marr still with me, and
yes.
Joe Coburn is still with me too. Andy?
I thought a very, very interesting little sketch about how the British system really works. There we have Nicola Sturgeon, the insurgent Scottish princess, charging down there, having led her great insurgency in sober black, head bowed, right at the heart of the British state. That's how we work.
Yes, it is how we work, but the point is, Andy, I think for lots of people watching, not least in Scotland today, what are they going to be wondering is the outcome of this election when all the talk was of power and voice at Westminster, when they're now confronted with a majority Conservative government? Where's the power there?
Exactly. Some people will simply be proud to see her there right at the front with her huge wreath. Other people will be asking themselves, is she being incorporated, brought in already? Is that what's going on? But she has now to deal with a very, very large and confident Conservative party, with whom she has always pushed to one side, doesn't even want to talk to or talk about. Well, now they're right in front of her, and she has no choice.
And the rhetoric, of course, there was that she wanted to lock out the Tories from government. She was going to work with Ed Miliband, even if he didn't want to work with her. Of course, that's all changed. They will be reconfiguring exactly how they move on from here in terms of approaches to this Conservative government.
At number 10, it turns out the lock is on the inside of the door.
Indeed.
Point well made, Andy. Sheffield, let's go to Sheffield. John Mann is there, Labour's John Mann. John, thank you for being so patient. I know you've been waiting quite a long time to talk to us. Your thoughts, then, on what's happened to Labour overnight?
Well, it's as bad as it's been since 1983, and if we don't act appropriately, then we'll be out for some time.
What does appropriately mean?
Well, we've got to adjust what we're about. We've been at the top of the party. I had to laugh listening earlier on. There's some criticism of your commentators of Labour spending too much time talking to itself. Would that there had been that level of dialogue. It's all been the clever people running things and fishing around, trying to get the right magic wand to get us into power, rather than assessing what do we stand for, who do we represent, how do we persuade people. And that's what we need to be doing. And that means, for example, we don't need yet another special advisor or former special advisor as the next leader of the Labour Party. We need someone who's done something in the outside world, what the general public calls the real world. One small but crucial thing, not looking inward but looking outward.
For you, if someone asks you in the streets today, what did Ed Miliband do principally that simply didn't work in this election, what was it?
Well, people repeatedly said to me that they didn't see him as a strong enough leader. Strong enough in the world is what they meant. And in the last 24 hours, or even less than that, all the don't knows, in huge numbers, came out and voted Conservative. I mean, I emailed over 1,000, 1,500 people who'd identified in the campaign as being don't know. And it was clear from their response that virtually all of them had decided at the end, regardless of who they wanted to be their MP, that they didn't want Ed Miliband to be Prime Minister, and voted accordingly. And that's why there was this late surge to the Conservative Party and why they're now in government.
UKIP were very keen to tell us earlier, John, that they had made as many inroads into the Labour vote as the Conservative vote. Is that your reading of it? And how did Labour cope with that UKIP challenge?
Well, certainly some of the Conservative vote went back to UKIP. I think Scotland, from what people told me, was a significant factor in that. But UKIP made some inroads into the Labour vote. And those Labour voters who've shifted to UKIP, some may stay with them for a long time, though they shifted a few years ago. Others said to me quite explicitly that this was a protest because they were fed up not being listened to on immigration. And it wasn't Europe that was the issue for the vast majority of them, it was immigration. And that's an issue that Labour hasn't addressed, and in my view it's an issue that Labour has to address. And interestingly, the real pitfall for David Cameron is this negotiation before the European referendum. And one of the key questions that we've got to hammer home as a Labour Party is, will David Cameron be attempting in any way to restrict the free flow of labour, i.e. immigration, within the European Union? Because that was a huge issue on the doorstep.
Is it too early for me to ask you, John, if you've got an ideal choice as the next Labour leader, who would you like to be seen leading the party?
Well, I mean, there's several candidates who would regard themselves as credible. They won't all be credible in the north of England. It will probably boil down to a choice between two people, I think. One is from the old generation, Yvette Cooper. Her problem is that she is from that past generation. And from the younger generation, I think that the person most likely to emerge as a candidate will be the Barnsley MP, Dan Jarvis. And I shall be holding a very early primary of all my Labour voters to ask them to make a decision on who they think should best represent Labour. And I think we need to do quite a bit of that in the party. Ask the people who vote for us, even a few of them who've left us, what they think we should do, rather than presume that we in Parliament and those who go to political meetings have got all the answers ourselves.
Joe?
Yes, John Mann, you said yourself you don't want to see another former special advisor as a leader of the Labour Party, and you yourself would prefer someone from the new generation rather than someone associated with the Brown-Blair years?
Well, I will hold a primary, but I certainly would hope that Dan Jarvis is one person who has his name on the ballot paper to be Labour leader, because he fits that criteria. There may be others, but he certainly fits that criteria. I'd like him to stand. I'd like him to start explaining his vision for the country and how he would reconnect with those voters we've lost.
Quick one.
Yeah, I was just going to say, he is, of course, if you talk to Tories, one of the most feared potential candidates, Dan Jarvis, interestingly. This was before the election itself. He was talked up as a former soldier. He has a very good, what we would call in the trade, backstory when you talk about trying to unify people. Would you want to see a quick leadership contest in order to take on this new Tory government, or would you like more soul-searching and a slower decision made?
I'm quite relaxed if we take our time, not so that we do too much soul-searching, but I think there is a danger that in the Westminster bubble, that people, it becomes the beauty contest of, oh, I like this person, I know that person, this and this person will give me a job, etc. Where Dan Jarvis has a huge advantage over perhaps all the other potential candidates is he isn't part of that. He's not connected into that. That's precisely why he's a strong candidate, because I think there's a mood in the public. They don't want people from the political class running the country. And if we're going to take on David Cameron and perhaps George Osborne or Boris Johnson beyond that, they're actually part of that same inner political class. And someone like Dan Jarvis is exactly the opposite. I think the public would really warm to that, because that's where they see, in my view, what I hear from them, where they want their politics and their political leaders to be.
John Mann, good of you to join us. Thank you very much. John Mann, there for us, the Labour MP in Sheffield. So, we touched on UKIP there, didn't we? And we touched on Labour's response to the UKIP challenge in certain areas. So let's join Jeremy again, who'll tell us a little more about the UKIP performance, Jeremy, because of this mismatch between percentage and number of votes and seats.
Well, that's the point here, isn't it? For UKIP, this first past the post system is really, really difficult. You can get 13% across the whole country and not get a single seat. So you have to focus to build some kind of parliamentary presence. And here is our UKIP building site for you. And we're just going to dig a bit deeper here and see exactly what has happened with UKIP. And it is very interesting. Classic reaction will be today, oh, they only won one seat. That's only part of the story. I'm going to show you first the foundations here. Let's bring them on. And these are the seats where UKIP came third. 364 third places. So more than half the constituencies in the general election they were in third place. Now, what we've done is we've coloured the bricks in the colour of the party, red or blue, no Liberal Democrats, I don't think, the colour of the party that won the seat. You can see it's pretty evenly matched between Labour and the Conservatives. But 364 is really significant because do you know how many it was at the last election in 2010 that they came third? How many seats? It was 4. So for them, they can now say, right, we've got a catchment here of seats we can start to focus on. And OK, the Lib Dems have had a terrible 24 hours, but they've had much success in the past through focusing, through zoning their vote. But there's even more information in this result for UKIP to really gorge themselves on. These are second places. We're building the UKIP Parliament here. Look at this. So in 120 constituencies, they came second. Now, if I have a look at these blocks, we can see, and I'm counting them roughly here, I think there's 7 Labour blocks, and we have 11 Conservative. So roughly those are the proportions, 7, 11, not quite 50-50, more Conservative seats, but lots of Labour seats in there as well. 120 seats where they came second. What they need to do is work out exactly where they are and pile into them, almost ignoring the others. And again, my question for you, do you know how many seats they came second in at the last general election? 0. Do you know how many seats they came first in at the last general election? It was also 0. This time they've got 1. So 1 turret on the top is their 1 MP, 1 first place. But looking below that, looking down at our construction here, you can see that UKIP really have something to build on. This is vital intelligence for them. They can work out where to direct their efforts and where to build their vote. And it may take more than 1 election, but they've got something here to start with. Hugh.
Jeremy, thanks very much. Andy.
And possibly the most interesting thing Nigel Farage said in his speech was that he wanted a generational step change in UKIP too. Lots and lots of younger people, particularly younger women, he thinks are coming over to UKIP, and he wants a big change in the party's image, away with the kind of old colonels with the dandruff all over their shoulders and new people coming in. Now, if he can achieve that, maybe the UKIP story is just beginning.
Andy, thank you very much for that image. Jo, quick thoughts?
Can we just have a look at Suzanne Evans? She wrote the manifesto, of course, for UKIP. She says nearly 4 million votes, 118. We just heard from Jeremy, it was 120 second places, 1 MP. And actually, what is interesting is she, of course, could be the new leader of UKIP, certainly talked about as a potential new leader. If we're talking about a woman taking over a sort of new generation, and all the talk, I was with Nigel Farage down in Thanet South, and of course, and early on, when it looked as if they weren't going to win that seat, it was all about the 2020 strategy, which I know you've talked about, all about coming second, all about building for the future. An admission of defeat, yes. I mean, a disaster in some ways for the Farage campaign, but obviously they will say what he did was he laid the foundations for next time.
Jo, since you know the guy a little bit better than some of us, parse for us, if you will, his resignation. Has he resigned or not?
Well,
just taking a holiday?
Now, there was a debate, because it was a long night in Thanet South, where he said, look, I promised I would go, said it in the book, but if I perhaps were implored to stay, if there was a groundswell of opinion, he didn't say this himself, but those around him sort of hinted, because they don't want to rule it out, then maybe I'd have to stay as leader. To some extent, he's the embodiment of UKIP for many people. It'd be interesting to see.
Well, we have another embodiment of UKIP because he's Andrew's guest. Let's go with Andrew.
We do indeed. You have got Patrick O'Flynn, who was the campaign director in this election. Also Sean Kemp, a former advisor to Nick Clegg. So, in a sense, 2 losers on either side here. Let me come to Patrick O'Flynn first. Taking the point there that you're second in 120 seats now, sometimes not a very good second, but you are second. Here's the problem, though. There won't be another election for 5 years now, almost certainly. 5 years is a long time for an insurgent party to have to wait.
Well, that would be true were there nothing else to do, Andrew. But obviously next year we have the Welsh Assembly elections, the Greater London Assembly and the Scottish parliamentary elections.
You don't do well in any of these.
Well, I think you ought to watch the Welsh Assembly elections in particular, where we're going to do spectacularly well. And by 2017, we know we've got something else to do. The little matter of an in-out EU referendum, and now the guy who's promised it has got no excuse whatsoever not to deliver it. And I can tell you, once the dust has settled on this election, by the middle of next week, the in-out EU referendum is going to become by far the biggest story in British politics.
But if Mr Cameron does deliver it, and we have a referendum, and we vote one way or the other, either way, isn't your party out of a job then? You've lost your raison d'etre.
I think either way, the opposite.
Really?
If we win the referendum, we've won.
Well, it'll be Mr. Cameron.
That would be
will say he's won.
fantastic. Well, no, because he expects to lead the Let's Stay in the
Oh, I see.
EU
By
side
winning,
of
you
things.
mean we'd vote to come out?
Indeed. If we were to lose the referendum, well, we've seen what's happened to the SNP in Scotland who've lost the referendum. They've gone on in parliamentary terms
Yes.
on rocket fuel. So there's potential way forward there as well.
You wouldn't just disband... I mean, if you've won the referendum to come out, you wouldn't just disbanding yourselves? What's your purpose?
I think a few years ago there'd be a good proportion of UKippers who might say I'll go and tend the roses, but now we've become a fully fledged political party with lots of different policy ideas who really connected with a big segment of public opinion.
Doesn't the party take a major hit if Nigel Farage is no longer your leader? I mean, whether people loved him or loathed him, wherever, he was a larger-than-life character for many people, particularly your passionate supporters.
Yeah.
He was the embodiment of UKIP.
Yes, he took us from a 3% share of the vote at the last general election and a handful, of third places to 13%, 3.8 million votes, winning the European elections last year. All those second places to attack at the next election.
So can you really continue with that?
Well, he's taken the party a huge way, but he's also built a team around him, and he says UKIP's not a one-man band, and that is clearly right. There's an emerging generation of talent in UKIP which can take the party on even further, I think.
Is he definitely standing down? Is he definitely ceasing to be leader?
He is definitely standing down as leader. He's invited Suzanne to be interim leader. Suzanne Evans, who made an amazing contribution in this election
Continue
campaign.
the process for me. She is interim leader.
She's interim leader. Then we expect there to be a leadership contest in the early autumn.
Could he stand again?
He could stand again,
He could
couldn't
stand
he?
again.
That would be,
So we may not have seen the back of him.
He hasn't ruled that out.
Would you-
Understandably, he's looking to take some time out and reflect on things.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Would you stand?
Well, look, I've said that politics is a team game, and you don't have to be the captain of the team to make a major contribution. And I think everyone at a senior level in UKIP needs to reflect not on ego, but on who is best placed to take us on even beyond the great success we've had already.
Forgive me, but I'm not sure if that's a yes or a no.
No, it's a bit Delphic, isn't it?
It is a bit Delphic, which means that you're
reflect.
getting like all the other parties now.
Oh,
You've come of age despite a rather poor performance. Speaking of poor performances, we know how bad it is, so let's not dwell on that. Let's look to the future. But it is a falling off. You had 57 MPs at the last election. Even that was a little down. I think you were over 60 in the previous election.
63 before
There
that,
you
yeah.
go, 63. Now 8. Tories will struggle. They'll try to hold on to a lot of these southwest seats that you've got. What would be the strategy now? Because I would suggest to you this is going to be a long, slow return if it happens at all.
Yeah, the Liberal Democrats are basically back to year zero when Paddy Ashdown took over. They need someone who's going to come in, sort of start afresh and say, right, how do we build up? And it's got to be a little bit what Patrick was talking about for UKIP, actually. It's a year-by-year basis. You look at what's up for election next May, where have we got a chance to fight, where is our grassroots operation good, and where can we start to build? But it is a long slog. I mean, this is not something that's going to happen in...
How long?
I mean, by the next election, I'd hope them to be fighting in more seats, but to be challenging to get back up a bit. But to get back to where they are now, you're talking 2 or 3 electoral cycles, in all honesty.
Is there anybody other than Tim Farron likely to attempt this?
The other obvious person is Norman Lamb, who's long been talked about as a potential leader of the Liberal Democrats. I suspect what may now work against Norman, who is a very good and very talented minister, is that I think the party might want a kind of someone who hasn't been in coalition, and they might want someone who's got Tim's skills, which are he's a very good rabble-rouser. He can go in a room and he can get a bit of fight, and he's a populist and he's a good campaigner. And I think those are all the skills that actually the Liberal Democrats probably need at the moment.
Where should the Lib Dems place themselves? Because I remember when, say, it was David Steele, the strategy was equidistant between Labour and Tory. Then under Paddy Ashdown, maybe Ming Campbell, Charles Kennedy, they positioned themselves to the sort of left of Labour. Then Nick Clegg goes into coalition with the Tories, and it's back more to equidistance he's positioned himself. where is the future positioning for them?
I think it has to be an equidistance. You can't start positioning yourself. That whole positioning, looking at what Labour are doing and then saying, well, to be a little bit more left-wing than them, that will get you a certain way, but if you ever end up in coalition, as you've just seen, it certainly comes back to bite you. But I think you have to have your own identity. For too long, the Lib Dems have basically looked at what all the other parties do and sort of crafted their identity in opposition to that. There's a bit of an existential conversation here for the remaining Lib Dem MPs about who are we as a party, and I think I would rather they were an old-fashioned Liberal party, if you like, which I think is what Nick Clegg would like, and actually what Tim Farron would probably like as well.
Bring back Joe Griffin?
Well, if only.
If you could. All right. Well, you've still got the Shetlands, which was his constituency. He's now Alistair Carmichael. Thank you both. There'll be lots to talk to you in the days and weeks and months ahead, I'm sure. We can all hardly wait. Hugh, back to you.
Andrew, thanks very much. Our last declaration of this election in St Ives. Let's go there.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the last one in the country. I, the undersigned Andrew Kerr, being the acting returning officer at the election of a member for Parliament for the St Ives constituency, held on Thursday the 7th of May 2015, do hereby give notice that the numbers of votes recorded for each candidate at the election is as follows. Tim Andrews, Green Party, 3,051. Graham Calderwood, UK Independence Party, 5,720. Andrew George, Liberal Democrats, 16,022. Cornelius Olivier, Labour Party, 4,510. Robert Simmons, Mebane Kernow, the Party for Cornwall, 518. And Derek Thomas, the Conservative Party candidate, 18,491. Thereby declare that Derek Thomas is elected as the Member of Parliament for the St Ives constituency. Thank you very much. Congratulations, Derek.
Well, those are the figures for you. That is St Ives. That is the last declaration that we have in this election campaign. A majority of 2,500 just about, on a turnout of 74%. And why don't we join Emily just to have a look at some of the figures for us. Emily?
So this is the last seat in the House. We know that they had to get them over from the Scilly Isles and helicopters. That's why it's taken a while. But look at that result. The final one confirms what a dreadful night it's been for the Lib Dems in this part of England, the southwest, Cornwall. It's a Conservative gain from the Lib Dems. And look at this recurring presence of UKIP now in third place. They're starting to look like the second party of opposition right through the East Midlands, in many of the seats in the southwest as well. They're making the gains. That hit for the Lib Dems looks bad, but as I don't need to tell you, Hugh, it's by no means the lowest of the Lib Dem shares on the night that it's been.
Thanks very much, Emily. Well, there we are. That's 650 seats in. That was our final declaration, and then just underlining what a painful 24 hours it's been for the Lib Dems. And that means that the new MP for St Ives is Derek Thomas. And Andrew George, who's been an MP, by the way, since 1997, always swears his oath in Parliament in Cornish. Pretty rebellious record as a Lib Dem MP, but has been very popular locally. Well, he's lost that seat in St Ives, and that is the final result that we have in this election, which means that the Conservatives have a majority of 12. Well, it's time to say goodbye to viewers on BBC Two. You can continue watching our BBC election programme by turning now to BBC One, and we'll be live until 6 o'clock. Bye for now.